Trauma is definitely one of the most difficult things that we deal with as human beings, if not the most difficult, right? Because it's the root of the psychological pain and the suffering that we experience. And the greater the trauma, perhaps the more the psychological suffering, the more the pain, and the more the suffering, until we come out. And sometimes that coming out can look like all sorts of different things, right? Different ways that we come out of this trauma. And there are even different phases in our lives where we use different tools to help us come out of this trauma. And sometimes what that looks like is layers, right? So the activities or tasks that we partake in, almost like layers and layers that get us to the more subtle work. And the most subtle work that I've done in healing trauma has literally been the energetic work. So energetic work in the body. And so you experience this, right? I think before I was doing energetic work, I did a lot of meditation, very intense meditation for like a year. And then even before that, I did talk therapy for like 2 years, right? So on my own podcast, I would just talk and, talk about, what I was experiencing, talk about my pain and things like that. And then I meditated for a year. And then the second year after, I just intensely meditated for like 3 to 6 hours a day, right? Didn't do much else. The second year, I did really deep emotional work. And that deep emotional work was my introduction to like real trauma, because that, that really was like the stories that were coming up, by my inner child. Like that was the first time I really came into like contact with my inner child, as in like hearing its stories and its pain and its voice. And I think before that, several years, maybe 7 years before that or so, or 5 years before that, I had an experience where I did like a guided meditation with a practitioner. And I remember the practitioner helping me. The meditation was involving my inner child and helping my inner child sort of like merge back into my body. And maybe that was my very first experience with my inner child. And after that, I never really had any other experiences. I don't think so. So there's about 5, maybe 7 years later. And, before this actually emotional work, like I mentioned, I did like 1 year of just intense meditation all day. And so that second year, that's when this like raw kind of work started. And this work was this was the most difficult work that I had done in my life. Like this amount of this kind of rawness, like you feel pain in a way that you haven't before. And so there was a lot of crying. There was like a lot of I remember laying in bed for like hours at a time, like at night, or even just during the day, maybe 2-3 hours just straight, just like sitting with the inner child, like sobbing, crying, just like curled up, and this work is tremendously difficult for anybody that goes through it. It's the most difficult work that we ever do in our life. And it's no wonder that this work only comes to us when we are ready, right? So when we are strong enough to actually revisit the inner child and to heal it. And the magic of this, when you're first going through this process, it seems like you can do very intense healing with your inner child about one particular story, right? That, it will like keep bringing up the same story again, minute after minute, and you work through it for like maybe, 2-3 hours straight, that same story even. And maybe there's like a few days rest, right? Let's say, 3 days later, it's, you started on a Monday and now it's Thursday maybe. And you find the same story coming up. So you find yourself in the bed again, right? And the same story comes up, right? And so you think to yourself, oh, you just did this, right? it's almost coming up again, the same exact story. And so you go through the whole process of just feeling it and being with it again, right? And this can happen. This story can come up. The same process can occur multiple times. And I think for me, in the 2-3 months that I did this kind of like, just all I did during those 3 months was just this kind of, for a few days take rest, right? And then again, the 3rd or 4th day, it would happen again. And it's almost like you really need that rest in between to like recover. Like your nervous system, your body just needs that rest. Like you need that rest. And so it would happen again. And then, I would, there comes a point like where you realize, oh gosh, I don't have any control. Like I could do so much healing for 3 hours, and then again, again a few days later, again another 3 hours, and then now it's the 4th or 5th time that the story is coming up, right? And so we don't get to determine, how the healing happens or when it actually occurs, like when the story is healed, when that story or that life event or even that trauma personality, right? That's the biggest like test of patience, right? You can do like the deep inner work, but that trauma personality, right? That childhood persona that developed when you were 4 years old, by the time you were 4 and became a hardcore people pleaser, let's say, right? You don't get to determine when that entire personality is dissolved, right? You don't really get to say, you don't have any say in how that healing occurs, what it will look like, or when it will actually be healed. And I really think that's like part of like the magic of life, right? The not knowing. And then also like the not knowing, it's part of the magic because it builds a sort of like patience in you, and you really have to surrender all control. And I think that's the most difficult part about all of this, right? It's that surrender. It's that surrender of like, the thing that I want most is really just, it's to heal, right? It's to be free. But now I see like, like even my freedom, right? It entails the bondage as well, right? And that's what's truly profound. That's what you realize in healing. Like, okay, like I have this part of me that is chained, that is broken. And to be okay with that part of me, that is ultimate freedom. That is true freedom, right? It's not necessarily to be free of that part. It's to be free of that part. When you truly are free of that part, you don't mind having that part. You don't mind the existence of that part, or the coming and going of that part, or if that part was always here and never left, right? That's true freedom. And so this healing process lasted for me, this very just deep emotional work lasted about 3 years, and it just literally looked like the stories coming up, and sometimes I'd be on the balcony, right, and it would come up, but most of the time it was just like when I was in bed, I would just be laying in bed and it would just like arise, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, it's gonna be another night of this. And something in you, like a thought will arise and it will say like, oh my gosh, not again, right? Or I don't want to go there. And it's important to sort of like recognize these thoughts for what they are, and that's fear, right? There's a part of the mind, right? And it's the same part of the mind that maybe has been running from this work your whole life, right? Even though it didn't look like this work, right? There's a part of you that has been running from exactly this, right? At your core, it's been running, like there's something, in you that has been running from exactly this your whole life. And so that part of your mind will still arise, and will also have ideas about what this will look like, right? So like what the healing will look like in the next moment, or the next hour, or like the next step, or the next day. It will continue to have ideas, and just know, that that's just the mind. That's the mind's way of trying to protect, is, is having some kind of like idea, right, as a form of control. But you should know that whatever idea it has, right, about the healing, or what it will look like, when, what, how, it's usually never what it thinks, right? And even like it's like the way in which it imagines you'll suffer, right? The pain that it imagines that you'll feel like through this healing process, or even like in one step of healing, like any step of healing, like it'll imagine some kind of like pain, or what you'll, how like the kind of pain that you'll experience, right, when you do this healing. Even to recognize that as like, okay, like that's just its form of control, and the actual process, like anything in life, right, like when we do anything, the mind just has an idea about it, right, just to recognize like, okay, that's just another idea, of it, and the process might not look like that at all, right. So even the next step, or like when I actually come back to it, whenever I do, it's not gonna look like that at all. So the mind just it's the same part of the mind that ultimately, just dissolves. And we call this like this part of the mind that's kind of like grasping for control in this way, right? We can, like, sometimes in spirituality we identify it as like the seeker personality, right? Or we could just label it, like, we just think of it as like the fear-based mind, right? And it's quite easy. It becomes quite easy, although at first, right, and like literally because you have been fully conditioned, right, fully living in the fear state, as in like the identified state, right, the identified state as in like the identity that you took yourself to be, right, which is what the identity that was born out of fear, right. So because you have been living in that state for so long, literally when you heal, and when you make this transition, right, it'll, like, you will come out of that state more and more and more, right. So if you think about it, like fully living in a delusional state, coming out more and more and more and more, means that you will continue to see increasing levels, or deeper depths of the delusion that you are still believing in, right. So there'll just be like more and more layers. Like the more and more you come out of it, you're just going to work through the layers of the delusion that you're in, and and then you're going to get to, like, pretty soon, like the end, right, if there is one, right, of the delusion. And I'm not quite sure if there's an end, or if there's some delusion that still continues throughout our life. It's possible, right. It's also possible there is an end. What I can say is that the majority of like your experience, having gone from like the chatter of that you were experiencing before, like that like mental noise and that psychological suffering that was very unbearable at times, right, that subsides. That definitely subsides. And that's why, a lot of people who experience that are kind of, that suffering really becomes like the catalyst for their healing journeys, right. But you don't have to wait for that. Like if you've gone through something difficult in your life, and you think that it is, bothering you in some way, or it's holding you back in your life in some way, sit with the story, sit with the painful thoughts that arise, and feel the pain in them, because there's pain there. And up until now, we've just tried our best to cope with it, but we haven't felt it. We haven't felt that like raw pain and that raw emotion. But at this point in your life, if you're watching this video and you, like, something in you is feeling called, you probably are ready to feel that pain. So just allow it to arise however it arises, right. And just really allow the healing process to take place, as it will take place naturally in its own way. And it might not look anything like what I shared with you about my experience. It might not look like that at all. So it's just very open. It's very important to keep an open mind, because the way in which this happens is always different for everybody. But I think something that's so powerful, and that what is a common thread perhaps between people who heal, right, is who heal their traumas and their life's pain, right, is a sort of like, when we talk about healing, right, what does that mean? It means feeling. We need to feel in order to heal. And for much of our life so far, like, our ability to feel has even been shut off, because our body and our nervous system and our brain is quite brilliant, and its one job is to protect us. And even if that means turning off like our ability to feel, or our ability to our nervous system, right, becoming activated, right, and picking up, cues and warning signals and things like that. It will even shut that off, right, all in an attempt to protect us. And so the body is quite brilliant in this way, right? But if you do want to live your best life, your true life, your authentic life, you want to do this work. And actually, there is no way to access your whole self, your full version of yourself, your greatest version of yourself, without healing your wounds, because our wounds are such a significant, they become a really significant part of who we are. They form our psyche, they form our inner experience, they form our operating principle. And that's what fear does, literally, because the brain's one job is just to survive, right? Fear literally becomes, it takes precedence always, no matter what you're thinking about, no matter what you're doing in your life, right? Any activity, any, task, any event, any, anything that you want to embark on or accomplish in your life, wherever there's fear, and this is true for any moment, fear will always dominate the mind, always. And so you have to really work through that fear, and we are, right? Like, we are in each moment. But you have to work through, like, the deep fear, like the deep-rooted fears, right? And so if you've encountered significant trauma in your life, right? Even if it was just like, in your childhood, or it was like an isolated life event, like an illness or a transition or a loss or a divorce, right? You have to do that work. You have to do that work in order to, like, integrate, right? Like, so the wound kind of forms like a personality in you, right? If that's what fear does, and it's a fear-based personality that develops. It's operating from fear. It's operating from that specific fear, that specific wound, and that becomes you. That personality becomes you. So now, like, instead of just being like Zakia, like, the childlike, free, version of myself that I was when I was a kid, let's say, right? Now I become like Zakia, like the people pleaser, right? The wounded one, right? Because at 4 years old I had to, please my mom, make my mom happy, right? So whatever that fear is in your life, you become that fear, right? Like, let's say I had a traumatic illness. Now I'm afraid to go to the gym, right? Because I don't want to contract COVID, or now I'm afraid to, like, be in, like, closed rooms with people, or, like, any rooms, like if there's like a club or an activity happening in a room, I don't want to be like in a like claustrophobic room where there isn't, like, air, like, I'd rather be outside, right? So we really have to work through this fear, because literally if we don't, then we will be making decisions from this place of fear, and it will literally govern our life, right? And I know none of us, right? None of us wants that for our life. None of us wants, like, even just the idea of that, like, okay, like, I have to make, like, decisions out of fear, right? Like, it just doesn't sound good. It's not something that we want. And what's quite different about this is that there's a psychological identity, right? That's what we heal, right? So on the outside, right, like, if you still aren't attending that club because it's in a closed room, right? Because let's say you don't, it then becomes like something where, like, your body just naturally, without the psychological identity, you'll find yourself, like, not attending that club, right? But there won't be a psychological sense of suffering, right? So let's say you still make that decision. The decision is still made, right? Not to go into that closed room, right? But it's not happening from fear. The decision is being made in your conscious mind. And that's what's so tricky to really talk about and explain and decipher here, because until you've experienced, like, okay, there's actually a psychological identity in here, that's my ego, right? That, that's the one that's suffering, that's the one that's feeling fear. And so what happens when you heal this, right, is that the same actions actually could, like, similar actions could actually be happening, right, on the outside. It's just that they're not rooted in this psychological identity, in the psychological wound. And so now you're thinking, like, you're trying to understand this, I know, and you're, some of you at least, and then you're thinking, okay, so if it's not made from the psychological identity, what's the difference? The difference is it's made from your conscious presence, and you're not psychologically suffering, right? You're not living in fear. The experience that you're having is not one of fear, right? And so maybe that just means like you'll have less anxiety inside, right? You won't experience as much anxiety, even though you are making that same decision. So it's quite tricky. It's quite fascinating to like even explore this, but but sometimes, like, even when we heal this fear, we find like, oh, okay, like I'm making the same decision, but it's almost like, okay, I'm making the decision, but it's not coming from a place of fear. And that's so fascinating to experience as well. Yeah, that is really fascinating.